Welcome back to the Game Collection. The Nintendo Wii isn't a console renowned for its RPG selection the way that some consoles are. It's no Nintendo 64, which was such a barren desert that some of us even resorted to playing Quest 64 just to survive. But I can't really think of too many real standouts, only a couple handfuls of them. But there was one game that's a bit of a standout on the Wii for a litany of good and not so good reasons. I am SuperDerek, and this is Arc Rise Fantasia.
Arc Rise Fantasia was developed by a small studio called ImageEpoch, who is perhaps best known for their Nintendo DS RPG series, Luminous Arc, and the Fate Extra series. The company was founded in 2005 by Ryoei Mikage, and often features some talented production members such as the legendary Yasunori Mitsuda and Kenichi Yoshida, the character designer and lead animator for Eureka 7, who also happens to have roots at Studio Ghibli. Arc Rise Fantasia was the company's first console release, launching in mid-2009 in Japan and 1 year later in North America in mid-2010. Arc Rise Fantasia takes place in a medieval sci-fi fantasy fusion setting where the world is divided into two religious factions that worship the same god, Issa. Those two opposing factions are that of real and imaginal. Glossing over a lot of tedium, there's a substance infecting the planet called ozone, which is causing the planet to crystallize, resulting in the death of all living things on the planet. And of course, what to do about this ozone and crystallization are one of the major points of contention between said religions. In Arc Rise Fantasia, the story follows Lark Bright Lagoon, a mercenary working for the Empire. Soon after the game opens, we find Lark fighting a fell dragon atop a giant airship. Things take a turn for the worse when, after falling from the airship, the fell dragon begins to self-destruct. It is at this time when a mysterious girl shows up and, pulling a page from Yuna's book from Final Fantasy X, sends the dragon off to the afterlife without exploding, saving Lark's life in the process. It is soon revealed that this mysterious girl is in fact the Diva of Imaginal, a high priestess of sorts who plays a huge role in shaping the future through their pilgrimage and subsequent influence over Issa, the planet's god. Arc Rise Fantasia is a classic tale of boy meets girl, girl saves boy's life, boy finds himself getting wound up in a battle between good and evil while the fate of the world hangs in the balance, making friends and enemies along the way. You know, that classic tale. Viewing the story through the lens of objectivity, there are plenty of beats within the game that you will no doubt have seen play out a dozen or so times before. I've gone on record saying before, I don't really mind tropes in and of themselves, it's all about the execution. But it is when those tropes are used as a substitute for substance that the problem arises. And on the subject of execution, I've seen better. I couldn't find a credit for a writer for Arc Rise Fantasia, so I have to assume the director, Hiroyuki Kanemaru, was pulling double duty. And while Hiroyuki Kanemaru did work on Tales of Symphonia, as far as I can tell, he's mostly worked as a level designer. So if you're looking for something that's going to shatter your worldview, explore the potential of the JRPG medium, and bring about inner peace, well, this ain't it. There is a decent amount of predictability when it comes to Arc Rise Fantasia, double crosses and twists that wouldn't even shock M. Night Shyamalan. There was a love story, if you could call it that, but Lark was such a tsundere with extra tsun and hardly any dere, making this would-be love story feel completely one-sided when the game remembers to pick up the plot thread at all.
Now, I know I've been pretty hard on this game so far, but I do have some good things to say about it. But before I dig into the good parts, we've got to talk about the characters of this game.
I already briefly touched upon Lark's abrasive attitude toward his love interest, but somehow he's also managed to attract the absolute adoration of a fellow mercenary, Nico the walking liability, Adele, his childhood friend Alf, who also happens to be the Prince of the Empire, and the Prince's brother and heir to the throne, Sir Vice. And don't ask me how he managed to win over the hearts of so many with so few positive personality traits expressed throughout the game, but honestly, that's all fine by me. These characters pretty much all deserve each other. Outside of this merry band of narcissists, the game does feature a few characters that are actually pretty cool. Raston, Serge, and Leslie are the three characters who I personally felt were best developed, even though Serge is pretty much the stereotypical skirt-chasing cool guy, and Leslie is the obligatory hypersexualized man-chasing waifu. And if there was any doubt that that's the role she was designed to fill, feel free to look up more information about the original Japanese bikini design of Captain Underboob. At least they didn't make Cecile, the obligatory loli, fill in that role too, because I honestly wouldn't have been that surprised. Not helping make the case for any of these characters are the voices. I don't really like to speak ill of voice actors, but in this case it's unavoidable. Arc Rise Fantasia is somewhat notorious for its voice acting that sounds like it came from an earlier era when convincing performances were the exception to the rule.
Hey, watch where you're going, you idiot! I'm sorry, idiot?
I don't believe we can place all of the blame on the actors themselves though. In fact, I believe most of the blame here is in the voice direction and casting choices. Imagine how bad a movie would sound if someone took the script, cut out all of the lines of dialogue, and gave each actor only the lines of dialogue to read in a room by themselves with no context for the actions that occurred prior. How awful would that sound? Well, nearly every line of spoken dialogue in Arc Rise Fantasia is an exploration of exactly that question.
Do you have any idea who you're talking to, huh?
Long time no see, Nico.
Whoa, hey, Prince Elf. And
The story of this game's localization is a pretty interesting one. Initially, Marvelous Entertainment, the Western publisher, was going to work with the localization team from Xseed Entertainment. However, in order to, quote, maximize profitability, they changed their mind and went with Ignition Entertainment, who in turn used a localization company called Entalize, a localization company already notorious for their work in Muramasa, the Demon Blade. That, along with Arc Rise Fantasia, were their two first video game credits. Entalize, it should also be noted, is a localization company located in Japan, which I believe goes a long way toward explaining how things got so bad.
But in a twist, this terrible localization has been immortalized in the echelons of so bad it's good territory. The bad direction has imparted the game with everything from subtle charm to outright hilarity. The game does have the option to decrease the characters' voices all the way to 0, and there is also an undub available on the internet, but there is also one very important reason you may not want to do that, which I'll get to soon. And that means getting used to the bad voice acting is one of this game's many difficulty curves. Which brings us to the gameplay. Here's where I absolutely have to give praise to Arc Rise Fantasia, because what we see in Arc Rise Fantasia is a turn-based RPG that breaks away from so many staples of the genre that it highlights how similar so many turn-based systems actually are to one another. The major reason I don't think you'll want to turn off the English voice acting is that during boss fights, characters will give you verbal cues, warning you about when the enemy is about to use an explosive ultra attack against the party, giving you an opportunity to quickly heal and defend. If you can't speak Japanese, the undub will likely not help you much, and these warnings are not subtitled on the screen, so it really is one of your only major cues that will help you avoid unnecessary party wipes. I believe the biggest departure from a standard combat system is the introduction of the ability point system. Each character in your party has an ability point stat, a maximum AP, and the AP restoration each round, and these stats increase gradually over the course of several levels. During combat, each of your active party members' AP are pooled together. Actions selected for each character cost a set number of ability points, such as defending or attacking an enemy costs 2 ability points, using an item costs 2 to 3 ability points, casting high-level spells can cost several ability points, and not every party member has to act, and other party members can act several times in a single round, if you have the points for it. Later in the game, when you have plenty of ability points, this is extremely important to keep in mind as you manipulate turn order in order to heal or defend right before incoming enemy attacks, or synchronizing your character actions together into chain attack combos, synergize magic attacks into mega magic attacks, or combining special abilities with your party to perform massively devastating Trinity attacks. However, some actions cost more than just ability points. Magic spells, for instance, take up spell slot charges, not unlike how magic works in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, if you're familiar. Special skills cost SP, which slowly regenerate as you act and are attacked by enemies. Consider this Arc Rise Fantasia's version of craft points from Trails in the Sky. And Lark, this game's version of a summoner, can summon Rogress, godlike beasts that consume 100% of your RP, which regenerate excruciatingly slowly, to the point of being usable only once, even during an extended hour-long boss fight. Aside from the bounty of points you'll be managing throughout combat, you'll also soon find that different weapons don't necessarily impart you with increased attack power. Instead, equipped weapons have a 4x4 grid upon which you can place arm forces, which are kind of like perks. Weapons, upon purchase or discovery, come with 2 to 3 arm forces already equipped, one of which is permanently affixed and the other is unlockable by leveling up your weapon. Once unlocked, you can remove said arm force from the weapon and place it upon any other weapons you have available. Affixing the arm forces you desire to the weapon you want plays out sort of like a highly restricted game of Tetris. Filling all 16 blocks of your weapon's arm force slot will unlock the weapon's secret, a bonus effect that can ultimately make the weapon do way more damage or grant the character hundreds of extra hit points or any number of possibly beneficial attributes. These perks make small differences by themselves, but cumulatively can add up to sway the outcome of battle. In order to get the most out of the weapons, you'll need to grind weapon points from battle to unlock all of the arm forces that you want in order to maximize the number of options you have available when composing your weapon loadouts. And finally, characters don't have innate magical abilities. They don't learn magic spells gradually over the course of the game. Instead, throughout the game, you can locate magical orbs with elemental attributes of different levels and strength. At magic shops, you can purchase orb slots for each character, or purchase charges for each level of magic spell, or increase the character's elemental affinity for each element, such as earth, wind, water, or fire. While you're out and about, you can also change which orbs you have equipped. Placing the same 2 orbs on a character will increase the level of the spell that they can cast. Placing non-opposite elements adjacent to one another on the board allows them to combine and grant the users secondary magic elements such as light, dark, ice, and lightning. So in the lead up to a boss showdown, in addition to micromanaging your weapon loadout, you'll also need to make sure you have the elemental orbs equipped to give you the combinations of magic that you will intend to use. And if that sounds like a lot to juggle, you're absolutely not wrong. It is a lot to juggle. Wrapping my mind around everything in this game was a real struggle, but the result is a massively flexible combat system, the likes of which I've never seen before. The game demands that you fully understand the mechanics at play to progress. Failure to optimize will result in repeated failure, because Arc Rise Fantasia is a difficult game. But the feeling of overcoming a challenging boss fight can feel rewarding, especially when the deck seemed stacked against you the first time around. You will die in Arc Rise Fantasia. Learning from your deaths against boss fights is how you will eventually win, sort of like Dark Souls. However, Arc Rise Fantasia is not the Dark Souls of JRPGs, because Arc Rise Fantasia punishes death and failure by returning you to the title screen. If you haven't saved recently, you will lose all of your progress. If you died during a boss fight and the last save point was at the entrance to the dungeon, you'll have to traverse that entire dungeon all over again. Speaking from experience. You don't get to keep your experience points, you don't get to retry or continue, you don't get to get back into the game quickly. For perspective, my playthrough took 98 hours, but my clear time was 88 hours, meaning I lost roughly 10% of my playtime to game over screens, mostly due to boss fights, though I did also die a few times to mobs. Luckily, those mobs can be spotted from the world map and local map, so there aren't any random encounters to be annoyed by. Also, even though your party is restricted to 3 main characters plus 1 guest, the party members who aren't at play still gain levels, so that's one more quality of life aspect you don't have to worry about. I appreciate that Arc Rise Fantasia isn't afraid to bring the difficulty, and I do love the innovative mechanics it brings to the table, even if the result can sometimes feel like an unfair system that requires micromanagement. Another higher point for me here is the world design. Arc Rise Fantasia actually has an overworld map, which is something I've really come to appreciate more and more over time. The Wii suffered in the age of HD consoles, only being able to push out a 480p resolution. Arc Rise Fantasia manages to get the most that it could out of the Wii's hardware, but the overworld map with so many fine details is one area that the lower resolution becomes a bit of a hindrance. I suspect playing on an emulator with a much higher resolution would be a marked improvement to the experience. Overall, it's a fine-looking game. The characters and enemy designs all look pretty solid thanks to the work done by Kenichi Yoshida. Musically, the game is actually very good. There was a team of competent composers on board, the most noteworthy of whom being Yasunori Mitsuda of Chrono Trigger and Xenogears fame. Several songs throughout reminded me of parts of Chrono Cross, which is absolutely a great thing. Arc Rise Fantasia was a very ambitious game, and the designers clearly bit off more than they could chew in some cases. There were collectible outfits and such that you could equip characters with, but didn't really change anything but how the characters appeared in the menus. There are orb shards that hypothetically could be collected and repaired and turned into orbs that you can equip on characters, but the shards are found so infrequently and come in 16 varieties that throughout my playthrough I never came close to acquiring the requisite 5 shards of any one type to form even one orb. Guild quests are available to be completed, but sometimes offer meager rewards for all the effort. Some quests are open-ended and don't log your progress, so you also can easily lose track of what you need to do. There are plenty of optional bosses too if you're looking for that much more challenge. There's plenty of things in Arc Rise Fantasia to do if you really need something to help you kill time, but I found a lot of these optional tasks to be more trouble than they were worth. ImageEpoch initially had plans for crafting a prequel, but those plans never came to fruition. The company declared bankruptcy in 2015 following the release of their final game, Stella Glow. Arc Rise Fantasia was never ported to any other systems, and with the bankruptcy of ImageEpoch, that's unlikely to ever change.
Arc Rise Fantasia was an ambitious game that excelled in some areas but was ultimately failed by a series of comedic failures in the localization process. I think this game would have been remembered better if Xseed had been able to localize the game as initially planned. But at the same time, the utter failure of that localization may have saved this game from the obscurity of mediocrity, and instead imparted the game with a so bad it's good notoriety. It's one of the few games that in recent memory has caused me to rage quit for a night, placing it among the company of Persona 3's The Answer and Kingdom Hearts' Chain of Memories in that regard. But this game deserves better than that. It deserves to be recognized at least for having the courage to experiment and explore the JRPG genre in ways that few others have. And as much pain as this game has caused me, and as much frustration, it's also brought some unforgettable moments, intentional and otherwise. So even though it's rough around the edges, I could still recommend this game for someone looking for something a little more different, and isn't afraid of a real challenge. So with that huge asterisk in mind, Arc Rise Fantasia has earned itself a spot in the game collection.
The Game Collection is a viewer-supported show. If you enjoyed this review, please consider subscribing. For live streams of my playthroughs, follow me on Twitch. And thank you for watching.